We've been seeing fascinating events lately in China. The country is now under a series of brutal lockdowns. Due to various supply chain problems, many Chinese are starving, and most of the most populous and important cities and provinces in China are cutting themselves off from the outside world, including supplies of food. What's happened, especially for a state that a few years ago appeared so strong? As we'll see, I think this presages a total collapse in the Chinese order. China's a beautiful country with a long history that touches every end of the nation. With Magellan TV, you can learn all about China's past and their present with the docu-series Empire Builders China. The series features several of the most fascinating and spectacular parts of Chinese history, from the man-made Great Wall, the Terracotta Army, to the recent events that drive China today, like the Taiping Rebellion or Maoism. China Empire Builders is a really great series that gives a look into a country with over 1 billion people, and this series is only available on the documentary streaming service Magellan TV. Made by filmmakers of the best selection of historical documentaries and movies out there, they have content covering everything from the ancient world to current events, and from true crime to astronomy. Magellan's compatible with just about any device, and is 4K HD with no additional cost. It's a great platform for an affordable price. Magellan is something for everyone, and for my viewers who use the link in the description, they're giving out a 1-month free trial, so go to Magellan TV, set up an account today, and learn about whatever fascinates you. China is in a bizarre predicament. The short answer for the government's reaction is that the Communist Party will this autumn have its next conference, and Xi would not like to lose face before the party. Most of that doesn't make sense to Western eyes, so let me break it down. There are no pure absolutisms in history. Rulers must incentivize at least part of their population to be ruled and consent to rule, since rulers are incapable of ruling by themselves. This is true in China as much as anywhere else in the world. Although we view China as some totalitarian state, Premier Xi is dependent upon the elite coalitions inside the Communist Party. However, it appears as if Xi's support is slipping among them. Xi's been trying to exert authoritarian power over China, such as removing term limits, establishing the social credit system, increasing state surveillance, purging rival factions of the party, and the like. However, this increase at the center puts parts of the communist elite at odds with him. What's going on with these lockdowns is that lately, as we've seen COVID reemerge in China, the state has done massive, horrifying lockdowns to slow down its growth. The only incentive the officials involved have is to get COVID numbers as low as possible, and since China's an autocracy, there's no incentive to tailor these policies to people's real-life needs, given that the authorities will only get booted out if they don't hit their superiors' target numbers. This has resulted in horrifying policies like blocking off whole streets for COVID reasons for lengthy periods and without letting people leave to get food, which results in people starving. People literally flee their homes as fear of death in order to get food. As an example of how ridiculous things can get, officials are arresting farmers in places for farming in their fields alone due to COVID restrictions, which makes no sense. At the same time, putting whole cities under lockdown. If you dig a little, you'll find countless horror stories coming out of China. Since cities are so terrified of being put under a crippling lockdown that would destroy their societies, they're closing their internal borders. Cities like Shanghai, which is basically Chinese New York, have closed trucks from reaching them, which thus shuts off the supply of food. Most of the important provinces in China have closed their borders to out-of-province traffic, which includes food, agricultural trucking, or the stuff that keeps you and I fed. Volume for agricultural trucking is down 87%. At the same time, this doesn't just apply to agriculture, since basic essentials like manufactured goods, fossil fuels, lumber, and basically everything else is being prevented from internal transportation in China. Just for a brief comparison, imagine if this happened in America. For Americans in the audience, think of how little of what you consume comes from your home state, let alone the city you live in. In my home state of Pennsylvania, people wouldn't starve, but they wouldn't be able to afford anything except food. Meanwhile, neighboring states like Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York would see literal famine and starvation. This gets worse when you consider that most Chinese farmers are commercial and that they don't save seed from their previous harvest but instead buy new ones. Significant amounts of farmers in China's agriculturally productive northeastern provinces aren't able to get seeds for the next year, while they should be planting. It would be horrifying to see these conditions spread across the rest of China, which they already might be doing. The really horrifying thing to consider is that the conditions on the ground are probably worse than anything I've said here. At the same time, the news of this is coming out so fast that things will probably get worse by the time this video airs. China's a closed nation without any foreign journalists really there anymore. Remember, China is a country that was very nearly able to block out having monumental floods killing hundreds of people and affecting millions this year that the outside world only barely heard about from Chinese social media accounts before they got muted. If you're a Westerner, the logic chain of the events that are happening probably doesn't make a lot of sense to you. Wait, why would oppressing and starving your population result in increased popularity so the elite will remove you from power? Well, there are a couple pivotal pieces of Chinese culture that make this understandable. The first thing to understand is the Chinese obsession with face. In the West, morality is inner-driven. Whether or not you're a good person largely stems from whether or not you're right with God. Even Western atheists act this out if they don't say they believe in it. In China, morality is driven off representing your nation and status well. The Chinese have a concept of face, or are you bringing shame upon your social station? Xi Jinping has built a lot of his prestige upon defeating COVID. Then he developed a reputation of honor in Eastern terminology for being able to reopen China. The return of COVID will stain his honor, and thus Xi, to maintain his honor, must crush COVID as brutally as possible. There are big differences in the Western concept of honor and power and the Chinese. In America, if the government wanted to demonstrate its power by crushing dissenters, it would just make the country angrier and result in mass rebellion, since it would be a violation of the individual which stands at the core of Western society. In China, crushing dissenters is a sign of showing your honor and station. This was the core mistake the Japanese made by attacking the Americans at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, coming from an Oriental society, thought wiping out the American Navy would dispirit the Americans by demonstrating their dominance and confused the mass criticism of society in America for disloyalty. Well, in reality, it produced the opposite effect of mass rage, social unity, and desire for vengeance. An incredibly depressing thing is that the government resulting in mass starvation in order to maintain the government's dignity is something that's happened many times before in Chinese history. The best example is the Great Leap Forward, which occurred in the 1950s, in which the Communist Party pushed really retarded economic measures that resulted in upwards of 35 million deaths, which is about as many people as the European theater in World War II. You see similar events in the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BC and the Sui dynasty in the 7th century AD. This is since the state developed so powerfully in China so early that there really weren't any countervening forces, whether an armed population, church, merchant classes, or nobility. The government has normally been pretty capable in China, and normally pretty enlightened and humane, but since there's no check on the central government's power, it allows what Francis Fukuyama calls the bad emperor problem, in which there are no checks against a really bad ruler. In the West, we generally see China as some far-seeing state with goals measured in the centuries, rather than cheap Western politicians who measure their goals in polls in the next couple weeks. A stereotype that I've honestly helped perpetuate in earlier videos, and which does have some truth to it. However, the Chinese government is also pretty reactive and has to live in a reality they aren't prepared for as much as Western governments. The main distinction is that the Chinese government controls the media, so they can pretend everything's according to plan, while in the West we have to watch our politicians scuffle around foolishly. Also, keep in mind China's a big country. It has 4 times America's population, and the province of Guangdong is nearly Russia's population. Most provinces are geographically and in population larger than European countries. Take Sichuan, which is 20 million people more than France and is the same size geographically. This means that much of China is locally governed, with the local Communist Party officials effectively ruling like kings in many ways in the provinces, with local power networks and routes that are sometimes difficult for the centralized government to tear out. The Chinese Communist Party has more people than the nation of Germany, and so that's a lot of varied interests. At the same time, non-communist interests have developed inside China, like the wealthy merchant classes, while the People's Liberation Army stands as a world inside itself. It's my impression that Xi Jinping is trying to exert his authority over both the Chinese elite and people, and thus trying to show with force that he really controls the nation with tight measures. Meanwhile, his inferiors trying to show their loyalty to Xi exert his policies as tightly as possible, which creates competition between them that rips Chinese society apart. Okay, we have to briefly pause the story of what could be our future to have a brief reality check on how China really exists now. Lots of Westerners view China as the power of the future and the beating heart of the new world economy. Many Chinese believe the same. That view makes sense, but it's wrong. Ironically, given it's a communist state that's supposed to push equality at all costs, the historic state that modern China reminds you the most of is l'Ancien Regime France, or France before the French Revolution. Let me explain. Both France and China are weak absolutisms, in that there was a centralized government that technically had the power to do whatever it liked, but in reality had to rule through various local elites that it had to give concessions to and work corruptly with. Since the absolutism was compromised by so many interests, it ended up supporting various corrupt social groups. Thus, the state ended up being ruled by the rich. We can see this in China, in where many people assume that they can never win a court case against a wealthy person since judges are so easy to bribe. People assume that bribes and corrupt deals with the government are necessary for business. There are a series of antiquated and crippling laws, for example those forbidding internal migration, which has resulted in millions of Chinese legally living outside their hometowns in cases similar to Mexicans in America or Libyans in France inside their own country. Various special interests in society have connections to government, making it very difficult to reform or hold corrupt institutions, whether private or public, accountable. Although the standard of living has risen, we see a series of other problems in Chinese society. The biggest one by far is their housing market, which is a great symbol of the Chinese government's mismanagement. The Chinese government's flooded their economy with money in some of the biggest money printing projects in history for the last 20 years. There's no way this doesn't cause a horrifying recession. As always happens with inflation, it results in eroding common people's standard of living, while also artificially raising the housing price, in that people invest in houses since they're an asset that doesn't go down in value as money itself becomes less valuable. This is a process that happened word for word in Japan 30 years ago, and like Japan, it all blew up in their faces. However, to complicate this, the Chinese government technically owns all land in the country and merely lends it to people who use it. However, what the government does is tax the land and then give it to their buddies who resell it, thus greatly inflating the price for the average consumer who buys the land. The government keeps doing this even though the effects in society are awful, since it provides them with a lot of income. However, this inflating of house prices means that the average resident of a city like Shanghai would take 41 years to pay off the cost of a two-bedroom apartment. The quality of life is punishing in China, with horrible standards of living for most people. Working 12 hours a day is good in many conditions. People live in tiny apartments and the dating scene is unbelievably awful. When we look at the Chinese birth rate, which is either at 0.5 or 1, with a stable birth rate being 2, we can see these trends in action. China is a country where people just don't have kids. A big problem is that in China, we're seeing a couple different age bulges, and the biggest one is the demographic of people who are in their late 30s, or are middle-aged but don't have kids, apartments, or plans for retirement. People really go insane in their biological future, which manifests through their ability to have a family can't be reached. China is projected to lose half of its population over the next 60 years, which will no doubt produce a horrifying death spiral. There's no way a regime can survive a population crunch on this scale. This is made even worse, however, by China's horrible dating scene, in which, due to a gender imbalance caused by the one-child policy, as well as bad geographic concentrations, many Chinese men don't have any potential to get married or date. Again, this is something we've seen before in previous dynastic collapses. The problem we're seeing is that what in effect happened is that the Communist Party has created its right to rule based off economic progress. But as that progress slows down, it means that there are less and less reasons for Chinese people to support the Communist Party, and all of the corruption that goes with it. On top of this is the mandate of heaven, or the Chinese concept that they can morally remove unjust rulers, which makes the Communist Party very worried. This doesn't even include other stuff I don't have time to get into, like pollution, how northern China is supposed to run out of water, class tensions, and more stuff I probably haven't even heard of. All of this means China really isn't looking forward to a good future. An important thing to consider is that revolutions like the French or Russian, alongside civil wars like the British or American, don't happen after eras of decay and poverty, but instead after eras of economic growth that's unequally distributed. The rapid commercialization of society and the breakdown of village life that comes with it seems to be a key factor, which is insanely socially stressful for societies. China fits all of those patterns. I hate to mention my boy Peter Turchin again, but he's a brilliant historian who created a computer model to predict the timescale revolutions would occur at. His computer models showed the Russian Revolution or Roman Civil Wars happening at the times they did, off a series of metrics like inequality, quality of life, government spending, and the like. Turchin found the metrics lined up for America now, but the horrifying thing is that China has every single one of these metrics far worse than America.
I don't know if Xi and his allies in the Communist Party will be able to deal with all of these problems currently happening in China. I don't know how long-term the effects are. If I had to guess, I think the things going on now will almost certainly result in hunger in China and disturbances. Beyond that, we could see anything between the collapse of the central state into warlords with mass death and revolution, to the government just cracking down before a little bit of tensions and people getting back to normal business. Honestly, at least for the next couple years, I'm not optimistic, given that the Chinese are already showing an incompetence and inability to execute plans that you'd expect from a country that would soon have a revolution. The fact that the Chinese are already willing to shut off their nation and economy over something as minor as COVID means that the situation must not be good. At the same time, how each province's government is acting independently means China is lacking unity of character. For the reasons seen before, I don't see any way China doesn't fall. To be honest, I think the chances the Communist Party survives the next 15 years are very low. I mean, can you imagine a relatively poor authoritarian country losing half its population that quickly and surviving? China seems to be reaching a tipping point. The government wouldn't be acting this irrationally and forcefully if there wasn't a reason for it. If I had to guess how things will play out over the next 10 plus years, I would say that China will collapse in a revolution. It's very difficult to say how, though. To explain why, I would say that one could figure out that Tsarist Russia would collapse before World War I, but you could have easily had worlds where communists, Slavic nationalists, Democrats, monarchists, or some combination of each of those come to power, since each of these sides had times where they nearly did seize power. Alternately, it couldn't even be taken for granted that Russia would lose the war. The Russians could have easily won World War I, and the demise of old Russia would have been much more massaged if the Russians won at Tannenberg or the Brusilov offensive. What I'm trying to say is that in eras in which things are in flux and there's chaos in the air, a lot of things can happen, and it's unfair to give a single trajectory. However, if China keeps starving its population, it will lose the people's spirit. The biggest factor is whether the People's Liberation Army will side with the people or the government if the government tries to crack down on the population. In both the Russian and French revolutions, the army sided with the rebels, which allowed the revolutions to succeed. In cases of war between the army and the population, the army will almost certainly win. A common archetype for situations like this is a combination of an external and internal war. For example, how the Russian Revolution was started by World War I, the French Revolution resulted in the Napoleonic Wars, the English Civil War resulted in Cromwell's colonial wars, and the like. The equation normally goes something like a foreign war creates pressures on a nation which results in an already split nation falling into revolution, or a civil war results in one faction of the elite killing the other, thus creating national unity for external wars. Once the nation's united under the radicals that have gained power, they go on wars of expansion. This brings up the horrifying option that China here causes a war with the rest of the world. Maybe Xi starts a war with Taiwan, India, or possibly America to unify China, only to have China lose the war and fall in a civil war. Alternately, China falls into civil war with, say, rabid Chinese nationalists seizing power, demanding China reach its manifest destiny. I worry that a China like this would be a massive threat to the world order. The Chinese across history have been pretty binary between being extremely effective or extremely ineffective, largely determined by the quality of their leadership. Although it is a toss-up, I think the chances are higher the Chinese would fight poorly in this war, like we've seen with Russia. However, the Chinese are by nature a very competent people, thus a China led by a radical Napoleon might be a horrifying threat, one capable of nearly tearing down the whole world.
As the population of China halves over the next 60 plus years, the units that hold China together like railroads, supplies, etc. stop working. China will collapse into various states and warlords like it has many times before in history during its warlord phases. When things this bad happen, people develop ideological justifications, and wars break out that kill even more people. You'll see communists, nationalists, Taoists, and probably stuff I can't even imagine develop as factions. Millions upon millions will die. As the food supply collapses, people retreat into the countryside to farm. Since rural populations have more children, this would effectively repair China's birth rates. Interestingly enough, I think the chances a Chinese prophet who forms a new religion arise are decently high. China is a giant belief black hole, missing any coherent belief structure. At the same time, the suffering would be so immense that people would demand answers. You've also already seen the prophet Hong Shu Quan, who led the Chinese Taipings in the 19th century when the country was going through a crisis, and I put Maoism in the same category to be fair. I don't see any way China doesn't eventually reunify. Of any big area in the world, China consistently has been unified for the longest period of anywhere, really. However, the form China reunifies under is really up to question. Is this an aggressive, passive, Buddhist, communist, or new religion China? Or a China dominated by a new religion? Is it capitalist or anti-capitalist? Those questions will be decided in the age to come. What a Feltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Patreon, Pearl, and Pillar, the 3 Ps, where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my cultural history of America and civilizational history of the world. As always, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.